What's up, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next section in financial accounting. We're now going to talk about financial statement algebra in this video and over the next couple of videos. Going to do a bunch of examples. Now, before getting into this section, a couple of things I want to mention. Number one, when I'm doing the work over the next couple of videos, I'm assuming that you've watched the accounting fundamental videos beforehand, which are on the site before this section. There's going to be tons of carryover from those videos to this section, so if you haven't watched those, please make sure that you do so beforehand. Number two, when I say financial statement algebra, we know that there's 4 financial statements, but in this section I'm actually going to be covering 3 of the 4. So the balance sheet, the income statement, and the statement of retained earnings. The cash flow statement I'm going to save for a future section. Now, in this particular video, what I'm going to do is go through an overview of how we're going to solve the next couple of questions over the next couple of videos. I'm going to introduce a flow diagram that I'm going to be continually bringing back over the next couple of videos, and your prof or your textbook may show a different diagram or a different way to show these equations. Ultimately, personally, the one that I'm about to show you I find is the best and the most simple and the easiest to use when solving these problems, but ultimately all of these questions, they have one solution. So no matter which way you go about it, just make sure you're getting the same solution that I'm getting in the examples. And after this video, there's actually going to be a printout of this flow diagram, so you could print out a bunch of copies if you want and use them for the questions in the videos and in your textbook. However, I actually recommend that you draw out the flow diagram yourself, at least initially, over a couple of questions, just so you sort of ingrain in your mind how it works and you become comfortable with knowing how it works. And it's actually really easy to draw out every time. It's going to be really quick. I'm going to be drawing it out manually for all the examples. I'm going to introduce the flow diagram with full words, but then after I'll show you how I write out the same flow diagram in short form for the examples. So the way the flow diagram is going to start is we're going to start with the beginning of a period. And we're going to start with the balance sheet. So the balance sheet, we know it's what? It's assets equals liabilities plus equity. Right? And this area over here is going to be the beginning of a period. And remember, this is the actual balance sheet at the beginning of the period. So whether that's the beginning of a year or beginning of a month, this is the balance sheet over here. Now, as we shown in the accounting fundamental videos, this equity portion we actually broke down into a little bit more detail. We broke it down into owner's capital. I'll just put capital over here. And we also broke it down into retained earnings. Right? Equity is equal to owner's capital plus retained earnings on the balance sheet. So we got this balance sheet at the beginning of a period. And then what's going to happen is during the period, during the year, during the month, we're going to have a change in assets and then a change in liabilities and then a change in equity. Now, notice here, this equation held assets equals, as we know, liabilities plus equity. Well, also during the period, a change in assets is equal to a change in liabilities plus a change in equity. So if they give you, for example, a change in assets and a change in liabilities, and right away, we know we could figure out what the change in equity is. And then the change in equity, it's broken down into the change in capital plus the change in retained earnings. All right, so this portion we could break down over here. So notice it's not capital plus retained earnings, it's a change in capital plus a change in retained earnings. And this area over here is happening during the period. And you got to be careful, this over here is not a balance sheet. Remember, a balance sheet is a snapshot at one period of time. So over here, this was one period of time. That was a balance sheet. This here is the changes in the balance sheet. So it's not the balance sheet, it's the changes in the balance sheet. And then also one thing I want to mention, this change in retained earnings, we can actually go into more detail on that. We did so in the fundamental videos. We know that that's equal to net income minus dividends, but I'm actually going to show that on the side at the end just to not add too much complexity to this general flow diagram here. So we got the beginning balance sheet, we go through the changes in the balance sheet, and then at the end of the period, we end up with a new balance sheet, which is assets equals liabilities plus equity. And then this equity here at the end is broken down into retained earnings and then capital. So this is at one period of time. So this here is at the end of the period, and it's another balance sheet. So what happens is we're going to have beginning assets, there's going to be change in assets, and then we're going to end up with ending assets, right? So this column here flows together. We're going to have liabilities, there's going to be a change in liabilities, and we're going to end up with our ending liabilities. And then we're going to have equity, we're going to have a change in equity, and then we're going to end up with our ending equity. But you can also go into more detail. We could have a beginning capital, we could have a change in capital, and then an ending capital, right? Contributions made by the owners of the company. Or we could start with a beginning retained earnings, have a change in retained earnings, and then end up with our ending retained earnings. So we can go into a little bit more detail, and we will be going into more detail in that equity portion. But just in general, this is the flow of how these questions are going to work. Now, as I mentioned, this change in retained earnings, there's actually a separate calculation for that. So if we block this off, we can say that the change in retained earnings, from that statement of retained earnings, we know a change in retained earnings is equal to what? It's equal to net income minus dividends. Right? Net income comes from the income statement, and then the dividends is any withdrawals that the owners make from the company. And then the net income we could further break down. We know that that is equal to revenue minus expenses. Right? So we could break this net income down further into detail, revenue minus expenses. Now, a lot of times you'll see this portion within the flow diagram. Certain profs, certain textbooks might put all this within here, but in my opinion, it just makes things a little bit more messy, and it kind of takes away from the general view of how everything flows together. It just makes things a little bit more complex. I feel like setting up the general flow diagram like this, and then just having a side note for this retained earnings, not the retained earnings, the change in retained earnings down here. And then you could fill in these details, and then these details you could just bring back over here, and it just allows you to keep that sort of nice bird's eye view of how everything is flowing together. Now, as I mentioned, I actually recommend in the examples taking this flow diagram and writing it out yourself manually. There's going to be printouts for it as well after this video, but just over a couple of questions, write it out yourself manually so you get comfortable with knowing how it works. Now, the problem is notice that if we write out these full words, it's going to take a little bit long to do so. So in the questions, what you're going to see me do is actually use short forms for all of this. So I'm not going to write out the full words. The printouts will have the full words, but when I do it manually in these examples, the way I'm going to show it is I'm going to use just single letters or combinations of letters. So we're going to start with the beginning balance sheet. So I'm just going to write assets equals liabilities plus equity. And then I'm going to break down this equity into capital. I'll put a short form there. And then retained earnings, like that. And then I'm going to have a change in assets equals a change in liabilities plus a change in equity. And then the change in equity is going to be broken down into a change in capital plus a change in retained earnings. And then our ending balance sheet, let's put it a little lower. We're going to have assets equals liabilities plus equity. Then this equity portion, it's going to be the ending retained earnings and then the ending capital, like that. So that's the short form that I'm personally going to use when doing these questions. And then this change in retained earnings, we could have a separate calculation up here. We know that that's equal to net income minus the dividends. And then the net income we could break down into revenue minus expenses. All right, so notice that that was pretty quick, drawing out the full flow diagram in short form. And then, depending on what's given in the question, we're just going to fill in what's given. And then from here, once everything is filled in, we can see easily how we can get to things that they're asking for in the question. They're going to give us, like, for example, maybe beginning assets and then a change in liabilities and then maybe some information here. And then they may ask for what are the dividends, right? So we're going to have to go through it, fill in what we can in order to get that final dividend number. So that's just an example, and we're going to go through a bunch in the next couple of videos.